Have you ever wondered how we actually grade a country's economy? You know, how we decide if it's booming or if it's in trouble? Well, today, we're going to dive into the economy's report card, and we're starting with the most famous number of them all, GDP. So let me just ask you this. If you had to pick just one single number to say how well a country is doing, what would it be? It's a huge question, and for decades, pretty much everyone, economists, politicians, you name it, they've all had the same go-to answer. And that answer almost always begins with the heavyweight champion of economic stats, gross domestic product, or GDP. Think of it as our starting point, the first big, kind of blurry snapshot of what a country is producing. So what is it, really? Well, simply put, GDP adds up the value of everything made inside a country's borders for a whole year. We're talking everything from brand new cars to your morning coffee. The formula here breaks it down. You've got C for consumption. That's all of us buying stuff. I is for business investment. G is government spending. And that last part, X minus M, that's just net exports. So what we sell to the world minus what we buy from it.
But here's the thing about that big GDP number. It's a little gross. And I mean that in more ways than one. It doesn't really give us the full picture. To do that, we need to refine it. We need to sharpen the focus from a gross number to a much cleaner, much more accurate net one.
Think about it this way. To make all those cars and all that coffee, our factories, our machines, our roads, they all get used. They get worn down a bit, right? It's just like how your car loses a bit of its value every year you drive it. So shouldn't we account for all that wear and tear on a national scale?
Of course we should. And that is exactly where net domestic product, or NDP, comes into play. It's a really simple but super important tweak. As you can see right here, we just take that big GDP number and we subtract something called depreciation. This gives us a way more realistic idea of what we've actually created after accounting for what we've used up.
Okay, so we've taken care of the wear and tear. That makes sense. But there's another piece of the puzzle we're missing. Remember, GDP only counts what's produced domestically, inside the country. But what about all the citizens and companies who are out there earning money in other parts of the world? And that question brings us to our next term, gross national product, or GNP. Now pay attention because the shift here is subtle, but it's huge. Instead of focusing on location like GDP does, GNP focuses on ownership. It takes GDP and then adds in the net income that a country's citizens earn from overseas. So this is the key takeaway. GDP is about what's made in a country. GNP is about what's made by a country's people, no matter where on earth they are. So, now let's put it all together to get to what many consider the most refined number of all, national income. You can think of this as the grand total of what a country's residents have truly earned. To get there, we take our GNP, we subtract that depreciation, the wear and tear, and then we make a few little adjustments for certain taxes. This is the number that often gets pointed to as a country's true earnings.
Okay, I know. GDP, NDP, GNP, NI. It feels like we're drowning in an alphabet soup of acronyms, and it can feel, well, pretty overwhelming.
But what if I told you there's a really simple logic to it all? A secret key that unlocks how all of these things connect. And here it is. This is the master key. It's actually super simple when you break it down. First, to go from any gross number to a net number, you just subtract depreciation. Easy. Second, to go from domestic to national, you just add the net income from abroad. And third, to go from the market price to the factor cost, you adjust for net indirect taxes. That's it. Those three simple rules are what's powering all of these different measurements. All right, we've been talking about some really big picture stuff, trillions of dollars for an entire country. But let's bring it all the way down to a personal level. Let's talk about what all this means for the money that actually ends up in your wallet. Because let's be honest, that giant national income number is interesting, but it doesn't directly tell you how much money you have to go out and spend, right? So how do we get from that massive national number to your personal bank account? Well, the first step is something called personal income. This is the total amount of money that actually gets into the hands of households, from our paychecks, from investments, whatever, before the government takes out any income taxes. So we're getting a lot closer to a number that feels real to us. And finally, we arrive at the number that for most of us is the one that really counts, disposable income. This is your take-home pay. It's what's left in your pocket after all the taxes have been paid. This is your true spending power. It's the cash you actually have to buy things or put into savings.
Now, all this income we've been talking about, it's all generated by people who have jobs, which naturally brings us to another massive topic, employment. But when you ask the question, what drives employment? Well, you don't get a simple answer. In fact, you get one of the biggest, most classic debates in all of economics.
On one side of the ring, you have the classical view, which basically says, let the market work its magic. And on the other side, you have the Keynesian view, which says that sometimes the market gets stuck and it needs a push. Let's quickly look at both. The classical theory is really all about flexibility. The idea here is that if a lot of people are unemployed, wages will just naturally fall. That makes it cheaper for businesses to hire people, and voila, the problem solves itself. In this world, the economy is like a self-correcting machine, and unemployment is usually just a temporary blip. But then the Great Depression hit, and it challenged everything. An economist named John Maynard Keynes came along and said, hold on a minute. He argued that the real driver of jobs isn't how flexible wages are, but something he called effective demand. That's just a fancy term for the total spending on goods and services in an economy. If that demand is too low, Keynes said, an economy can get trapped with high unemployment for a long time, and the government might actually need to step in to get the ball rolling again.
Whew, okay. We've covered a ton of ground, from the nuts and bolts of GDP all the way to Keynes. So let's just boil it all down into one final cheat sheet to make sure the most important stuff really sticks.
All right, here are the absolute essentials. Number 1, the difference between GDP and GNP is all about location versus ownership. Number 2, the difference between gross and net is always about subtracting depreciation, that wear and tear. 3, remember, national income is that super refined final measure of a country's earnings. And finally, Keynes's big contribution, the idea that the economy's balance point is where total demand meets total supply.
So we've gone through this whole journey of how economists measure an economy's performance. But it leaves us with one last, much bigger question. We have all these tools like GDP to measure the size of the economic pie, but do these numbers really tell us how fairly that pie is being sliced? And does a bigger pie automatically mean everyone is happier or that we have a healthier society? That's something worth thinking about. Thanks for tuning in.